Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast, the 13th and final time this season. It's a post-game edition of our show, and it's Daniel Gallen and myself coming to you from high atop Yankee Stadium in the press box as the night comes to a close here. December 27th, a chilly day in a baseball stadium. Not exactly where we thought the 2025 campaign would lead for Penn State, but they finish on a 4-game win streak under interim head coach Terry Smith. A 22-10 victory over the Clemson Tigers pushes them to 7-6, all the way back from 3-7 just about a month and a half ago. And Daniel, this is a matchup that wasn't the prettiest style of football. It didn't exactly look like two top 5 teams nationally like we thought they might be in the preseason, but ultimately Penn State more than handles its end of the business to get this one to the finish line. They win quite comfortably over Clemson, and that's a Clemson squad that had won 4 consecutive games. And the emotions on the face of Terry Smith said it again. He was very pleased with what Penn State brought to the football field, considering a lot of different circumstances around this program right now.
Yeah, we talked a lot about how Penn State was going to try to get things over the finish line. I think that you look at the work that Terry Smith did, you look at the work that this team did, they did that and more. To not only get to the end of the season with the ship still afloat, but to go on a 4-game winning streak capped by, a game where pregame they put out the availability report and there's 33 guys listed under out, and that didn't even include Chaz Coleman. So I think you were looking at 34, 35, 36 guys, from this roster who weren't available for 2 days game. And for Penn State to come out, play the way they did, wasn't always pretty. You're dealing with some adverse conditions. You're dealing with, some tough field conditions as well. But Penn State got the job done. And I think that you saw some of that identity that had really been developed over the past couple of weeks. And it yielded a nice win and, another trophy to put in the Lash building.
Chilly day today here in the Bronx. If you're here at the game, you're well aware of that. In the press box, it's an open air situation, so we're right in the middle of Mother Nature too. Yeah, Daniel had the hand warmers. I was rotating from the hand warmers to the keyboard, trying to stay sharp over the course of this matchup in Yankee Stadium. And it was 6-3. It was 9-3. It felt like neither team was going to find the end zone. And then in the fourth quarter, 3 total touchdowns, 2 of them scored by the Penn State Nittany Lions to pull away to a 22-10 victory. And Daniel, before we get into some of the keys of the matchup, let's address the obvious that happened here in the last 48 hours. That list of anticipated opt-outs grew, and Terry Smith was transparent. He told us he would be. But on Friday during a press conference coming off of Christmas that he had on Zoom with us at this point, 30 hours ago or so, he said we're going to be without Nick Dawkins, without Drew Shelton, without Nolan Rucci. Earlier in the week, we had confirmed that Zariah Fisher was not going to play in this game, a starting defensive end. So you started to zoom out a little bit and piece together that depth chart that has been so decimated. And by the time they got to kickoff against this Clemson squad, Daniel, they were without 4 of their 5 starting offensive linemen. The only guy that's been a part of that mix consistently has been Anthony Donko, who started at right tackle. They were without those 2 senior running backs that have meant so much to the program, and Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, who ultimately joined Singleton as an observer for this matchup. And then you look across the defensive side of things, Zariah Fisher, Zane Durant. You go to the secondary, Zachy Wheatley, A.J. Harris. These are guys who played a ton of football over the course of the year. We're not available today. You know what's happening behind the scenes with this coaching staff, the pieces that are in and out. And ultimately, I think when you got the finished product like you did today, Clemson looked more like the team that was sorting through all those kinds of things. Instead, Penn State was fairly in control of this thing. They had to get their offense in a different gear to be able to put it away. But this was never one where it felt like Nittany Lions were going to be the team that was overwhelmed in this setting.
Yeah, I think Terry Smith deserves, a lot of credit for the coaching job. And then you zoom in a little bit to these individual position coaches. Phil Troutwine putting together an offensive line combination that, it would be nice to give him truth serum to know how many times they rep that group of 5. Egan Boyer, TJ Shanahan, Dominic Rulli, Cooper Cousins, Anthony Donka from left to right. How many times did they rep that during the season, during practice? Probably not much, if at all. But, they were able to put these pieces together and get out there and I think put together a passable product. You talk about Stan Drayton as the running backs coach. We knew Nick Singleton wasn't going to play. At that same Friday call that you're talking about with Terry Smith, he said that Katron Allen, would be available and would be dressed. Allen was questionable on the availability report. He didn't play. And so, you're Stan Drayton, and you've got this stable of running backs that, didn't touch the ball at all during the Big Ten play. Quentin Martin hadn't taken an offensive snap all season. And then, you're force feeding Corey Smith on the opening drive. Then Quentin Martin ends up with 20 carries for 101 yards. And I thought looked pretty good out there. Like, there was just, all these different things. And you talk about the secondary, Anthony Poindexter is calling the defense. Terry Smith is the interim head coach, and you're taking, Zachy Wheatley out of that depth chart. Antoine Belgrave Shorter has been hurt. He didn't play. Elliot Washington and AJ Harris, you mentioned them, leaving. That back end, which is so strong, so deep, has a lot of interesting pieces. There's a lot going on there too. So I think these position coaches that stuck around, that saw things through, they did a nice job of putting these pieces together, moving guys around and getting them in situations where they could make plays. I came away, very impressed, and it was, some interesting things to see, that we hadn't seen before, that we were getting eyes on for the first time, and it made for, a little bit of more entertaining watch in certain ways.
Guys who are doing some of that juggling, offensive line coach Phil Troutwine, defensive line coach Deion Barnes, put out some messages in the aftermath of this matchup. It will be their final game as members of the Nittany Lions staff. Phil Troutwine moving on to Florida. Deion Barnes also off to the SEC with a job at South Carolina, expressing their pride for their units today. And in particular, Deion Barnes threw some praise in the direction of number 33. And that was a popular thing to do for Penn State coaches and players in postgame today. Dani Dennis-Sutton did not opt out. Dani Dennis-Sutton was not on a pitch count. He was playing deep into the fourth quarter and giving Clemson's quarterback, Cade Klubnik, a lot of fits. He finished with 2 sacks in the game, 1 early, 1 late. He has 6.5 sacks in the last 5 matchups. And you look at the 5 games before that, Dani Dennis-Sutton had 0 total sacks in those 5 games. He's a guy that through 7 games this season only had 2 sacks to his credit. And Daniel, we talked about this late in Big Ten play where it felt like he was someone rising to the occasion in a moment where a lot of people left this team for dead. He was a player who seemed to answer the bell physically and emotionally. We've talked for a long time about his 5-star pedigree coming out of high school. He's shown flashes of it at various points of his career, including the postseason last year and some of those playoff matchups. But tip of the cap to Dani Dennis-Sutton, not just for putting his team in a position to finish out in a 4-game win streak, but I got to think this guy helped himself make some money in the long run with NFL talent evaluators with what he did on the field. And then as they get into the interview process and really start to dive in to him as the person, I'd imagine there's a lot of character things that emerged here in the last 2 months that are going to help him out making that move to the NFL as well.
Yeah, I think in our conversations about Dani Dennis-Sutton, he really did stand out as an individual, that he was someone that, did things his own way a little bit and wanted, had his own way of looking at things, his own way of going about things. And, his comments after the game in terms of, why he played and, what went into that, I think showed that a little bit where, he called it a no-brainer. And he said that, he had made a promise to Terry Smith after the Rutgers game that he was going to play in the bowl. He was going to finish things out. And he'd also said he was going to win MVP. And I think if there was a writer's vote, I think that he probably would have been the selection there.
He got Terry Smith's vote. He got Terry Smith's vote.
Exactly. And Trevor Pena, 5 for 100 with a 73-yard touchdown catch on a day where, there weren't a lot of fireworks. So understandable. I get that. But Dani was just out there, like a, man possessed like he usually is, really putting his best foot forward, really making, a lot of plays out there, making his presence felt. Every single series, we were looking, is 33 out there? And he was. And I think by the time you get to the late in the second quarter, it does kind of sink in that, this guy isn't on a pitch count. Like, he is seeing this thing through. He is going wire to wire. And he really did. So, credit to Dani. To me, it's one of those things where the players who opted out, you know, I don't really hold that against them. Like, it doesn't make me think anything less, of guys. But I do think that playing, can make me think more of someone, like a Denai Dennis Sutton. And, I just thought that was a, really, neat thing to see. We all know what the score is, how college football works these days, the other things that are in play. But for him to go out there and have a really good game, I think that can be held up as an example of, what it looks like, when you see something to the end, when you want to, continue to put your best foot forward, make an impression. We saw the flip side where Kyron Hudson got rolled up on the first drive of the game, went down to the locker room, didn't come back. But, it's football. It's a brutal game. And, I feel, I guess, like, happy for Denai that he was able to come out, get through this healthy, have that kind of game and really end his career on that sort of note.
There are a variety of players who, you look at the 4-game win streak, you look at maybe how things have gone since James Franklin was fired and Terry Franklin became the leader, and there's been maybe a new approach or a new look at this roster in the 2 months that have followed since then. A few more of those are guys that we're going to talk about on offense. Trevor Pena, Andrew Rapplier. Rapplier caught an 11-yard touchdown for Penn State's final touchdown of the day, and he was a guy who was involved throughout. He had, I think, a 20-yard pickup or so wiped off the board because of a penalty early in the game. But, again, someone who's out there finishing off their blocks in the run game and then letting everyone on the field know about it vocally. Someone who's out there making plays in the pass game. Rapplier now with 3 consecutive games where he has reached the end zone after not scoring a touchdown through the first 10 games this season. Certainly has soared up that list of when you talk about priority roster attention type guys. Rapplier is someone you're discussing now at that tight end position. And Trevor Pena, like Denai Dennis Sutton, down to his final college game, spent a lot of time at Syracuse before he made his move to Penn State last offseason. And you look at what he's accomplished. I know this is one of your favorite stats that I've put out there the last few weeks, but his first 5 Big Ten games in a Penn State uniform, 0 combined 20-yard games. In the last 5 games since then, he has 7 20-yard gains. So 7 catches. That alone were more than he had in any of those 5 games singularly. And so he is someone who has really taken off. And ultimately, there's a long list of woulda, coulda, shoulda, and what might have been here in 2025. But Daniel, I think really going back to the coaching change, when this team started to get a bit more vertical, he was almost at 100 yards against Indiana. He is somebody that put together a really strong final stretch. He was named the official MVP of the Pinstripe Bowl today with 100 receiving yards, a 73-yard touchdown that broke this one open a bit, gave Penn State a 15-3 lead, and then put it out of reach essentially against Clemson. But kudos to Trevor Pena. Again, when we talk about guys being defined by some of the lower moments of this season, I think we've also got to reflect on those who stepped up and produced when a lot of people started looking away from Penn State.
Yeah, I think Pena coming on was I think it was something too where you look at it and you could see the pieces, you could see the potential early in the season, and for whatever reason things just weren't clicking. That the pieces that they brought in this offseason just didn't quite get in sync when they needed to. I do think that the way that things went these last couple of weeks gives you a little bit of, what could have been, shoulda, coulda, woulda. But I think for Pena, like, we knew that he had this in him when he got here. And, the changes that Penn State made, they were able to unlock it, and it really showed. I thought that touchdown catch was really impressive because, it was a sequence where Penn State, we thought that they were trying to bleed clock a little bit, but they go tempo on 3rd down. We've seen so many times where Penn State going tempo doesn't work or doesn't end well. And Grunkemeyer hits him perfectly up the seam. He gets sandwiched by 2 guys and just doesn't go down, and it's off to the races. I mean, that individual play in that circumstance, how things were going, it was just one of those times in this game where things really did fall into place for this Penn State offense. And that's something that we haven't seen that much this year, unfortunately. So I think for Pena, he was one of these guys that came in here for one more year. He had one more chance. He was, probably the most hyped of the 3 transfer additions, given his track record at Syracuse. And, it took him, a little bit longer than probably Penn State had in terms of the way the season was. But, it did click in. And he's someone, too, mentioning, you had your starting wide receivers in this game. I think Kobe Howard was out there for the first play, but you had Hudson, Pena, and Devontae Ross out there. Your three seniors that you brought in, for 1 year. I know that some people looked at them as like mercenaries a little bit, because they're coming in for one last ride, trying to win a championship. Those three guys saw things out to the end when that it was a pretty disappointing season in multiple regards for them. And Devontae Ross too, he was someone that inadvertently, I think ended up in a couple spokesperson type roles and spokesperson type situations where he was speaking for the program as someone who'd only been here since January in some tough circumstances. He handled himself really well. So I thought that was kind of a neat note where you've got three guys at a position that has gotten a lot of criticism, from anyone who has watched Penn State football this year. And they saw things out till the end. They were out there, for their final games up here in the Bronx.
Like you mentioned, Hudson a little banged up this afternoon. Devontae Ross, though, most catches he's had in a Penn State uniform since making his transfer from Troy. 8 catches, 84 yards in the day. His biggest game was a 35-yard pickup on a third down that helped set up Andrew Rapplier's game-clinching touchdown. And those third down plays were big for Ethan Grunkemeyer. The 73-yard touchdown pass to Trevor Pena was a third down play. I mentioned the 35-yard pickup to Ross. Over the course of the afternoon today, Daniel, Ethan Grunkemeyer, 7 of 8 passing for 147 yards and a touchdown on third down. He was 23 of 34 overall, 262 yards, 2 touchdowns, no turnovers. You got to go back to early in that Indiana matchup when things were starting to get away from Penn State. He throws an interception back on, what was that, November 8th. That's the last time he had a turnover in a game. And we're talking about him protecting that football throughout this 4-game win streak. And we heard from him afterwards, kind of more the same, Daniel. He has not made a decision. He wants to talk to his family. He wants to get a better feel for the new coaching staff here at Penn State. I'm sure he wants to have conversations about what other options may be available to him. But what do you make of the punctuation mark for his 7-game run as QB1 here with the Nittany Lions since Drew Aller went down with that injury in mid-October?
Yeah, I think as the season went along for Ethan Grunkemeyer in that starting role, he raised the floor every week. And I think along the way, Andy Kotelnicki and this offensive staff and Terry Smith, they trusted him to do a couple more things. You think back to the Iowa game and that Ohio State game. We talked about the ADOT stat of how far he wasn't throwing it down the field in those games. And then as time went on, you saw that trust. Obviously, when Katron Allen was running the way that he was, that helped a lot. And it never felt like there was a situation where they had to ask Ethan Grunkemeyer to do a lot, or there was a spot where they were asking him to do too much. And I think that helped a lot when you have a young quarterback in terms of setting these limitations for him and working within these guidelines. But I think that you saw like the poise, you saw the way that he carried himself. He's always out there celebrating. He's always out there, interacting with his players. He had one handoff late in the game to Tyke Hayes where, I think he tripped over. I don't know if he tripped over Hayes' foot or he tripped over Dominic Ruley's foot, but he ate it in the process of, handing off to Hayes. And, up on the big screen behind me at Yankee Stadium, they had a zoomed in shot of his face when he's going back to the huddle and he's laughing, like he's smiling. Like, I think that he's someone that, took the game seriously. I don't think necessarily he never felt like someone who took himself too seriously. And I think that was sort of the demeanor, that steady hand on the rudder that Penn State needed down the stretch of the season. So I think with Grunkemeyer, it's going to be really interesting to see what opportunities are out there for him. If he has an opportunity at Penn State, what this looks like, what the mechanics of everything will be, because the way that you look at college athletics, college football, tough to find steady quarterback play. That is something that is really in demand. People are willing to pay a premium for it. And if you have the opportunity to bring it into your program, you need to, because you need to have your ceiling as high as possible. But I do think that, Grunkemeyer, I think, it feels like he has established himself, as a quality P4 quarterback at this stage of his career.
Another second-year player in that backfield that we had not gotten any kind of look at really offensively is Quentin Martin. He had not entered a game on offense throughout his redshirt freshman year. Last year, 13 carries, 32 yards while preserving his redshirt in 2024. So quite frankly, everything that we have known about Quentin Martin is based off of what he did in high school as a big-time top 24/7 type player here in the state of Pennsylvania, or what we've heard from the practice field, which is, a vertical long presence, receiver skills, and we thought we might get to the finish line and just never see him involved. That changed in a big way. It was initially Corey Smith, the other redshirt freshman, who started and got involved. Eventually, it became the Quentin Martin show at running back, and Terry Smith said he really answered the call in the second half when they decided to lean on him. They saw some physicality, some between the tackle success for Quentin Martin that they just weren't quite sure of, and that they saw some well-roundedness to him at running back. 20 carries, 101 yards. Again, he had 13 career rush attempts through his first two college campaigns. So not only was this a real opportunity to get hit and dish out some hits of his own for Quentin Martin, but this was a great chance for him to put some film up there. I know I asked him, and he said he was really excited to go see what number 25 looked like in a Nittany Lions uniform in some game film, because he hasn't really had that chance. And talk about a position where we just don't know. It could be a complete reset. Iowa State's leading rusher is among those former Cyclones hitting the portal. Obviously, we're interested in all those guys, maybe joining Matt Campbell here, but you were looking to see if someone could make their case to close out 2025 at this position where we've learned nothing about anyone not named Katron Allen and Nick Singleton this season. It proved to be Quentin Martin today.
Definitely. It was, I thought too, this was really our first look at Quentin Martin, like as a running back, as your, typical, you're going to line up behind the quarterback, take the handoff and go. When we saw him in some of those looks last year, in his true freshman year, it was some gadgety type stuff. I remember there's, his like one snap at USC was a weird triple option play where he was on the field, with Singleton or Allen, and I think took a pitch from Drew Aller. And so to see him, whether or not he could be a every down running back, that he could be someone that you're handing off to, play after play, trying to drive down the field. I thought that was an interesting look. It's definitely intriguing when you see someone with that frame and the way that he moves, getting the ball, time after time. I think that this running back room, like, you've got a lot of these types of guys that are very interesting in what they could be when they developed, but like a lot of things, we just don't know if we're going to get that opportunity to see it through in Happy Valley, or if that'll happen elsewhere.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into a lot of these subjects more early next week, and by then we may have some news regarding some of these guys, because the transfer portal announcements are looming large. They're not going to wait until we get to that January 2nd opening of the transfer portal. I think we'll start to see some things trickle out for this roster. But for the sake of this conversation, Daniel, the defensive situation, we're not sure what the mainstay players will look like in 2026. We don't know who the play caller is going to be. But today things worked out pretty well. I know Clemson was hoping that their quarterback, a former five-star, a guy who was ranked up there with Drew Aller in the 2022 class, that he could have some kind of celebratory farewell here in Yankee Stadium. But it was a rough afternoon for Cade Klubnik overall. He ends up finishing with 193 passing yards. They finished total 236 yards on the day. Really a struggle for their ground game. Clemson under 2 yards per rush, gave up 4 sacks to this Penn State defense. And again, when you talk about the talent that was off the field, Daniel, and the fact that you had Anthony Poindexter for the third time in 5 years stepping up as a defensive play caller, the end result was quite impressive. And we should say, when Poindexter had this opportunity against Arkansas in the Outback Bowl, against Ole Miss in the Peach Bowl, it was 2 matchups where it really got away from them in the second half. And some of those talent deficits because of those opt-outs caught up with them. In this case, whether it was a coaching thing, whether it was a motivation thing with some of these players on the field, it felt like this group, outside of a couple decent drives that Clemson was able to put together there in the second half, it was pretty much a consistent performance from point A to point B here in Yankee Stadium.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think I said it on the pregame podcast was, looking at how this defense was handling itself, how it was moving around on the field. And I think you really saw that. They were flying around out there. They were hitting people. Darius Dixon was, I thought played really well in the secondary.
Very good.
obviously when you have Denai Dennis Sutton as your tone setter, like you kind of know what you're going to get in terms of putting out there. And it felt like the team was really able to feed off of that. So, I think that with that defense, Poindexter did a really nice job with it. And it all came together pretty nicely because there were some big names missing. There were some important pieces missing. And they were able to get it together and keep it together, across the whole way with, some true freshmen out there, some guys who haven't played that much, some guys that could, maybe be elsewhere if they really wanted to. And you got to the finish line only 10 points allowed to this Clemson team.
Dixon, 3 pass breakups that led the team. I continue to love what we see from the true freshman when he gets his chances. Without A.J. Harris again today, he was a starter. Babu Torre, a redshirt freshman, did some good things at safety. Amari Campbell continues to show up at linebacker. And then additionally, I thought that, some of the other guys that we don't see a ton of that got better roles today, Jameer Joseph, another cornerback in that freshman class. I thought he showed up in run defense, in pass coverage. And ultimately, we're going to get a longer look at a lot of these guys next year, but I don't think that cupboard is bare on defense. By the way, Jalen Harvey with his first career sack, as we saw, again, kind of a hodgepodge mix of players here. Xavier Gilliam got to start at defensive tackle. And Daniel, before we finish things off here, we've got to mention a special teams highlight, and he's really been a consistent success story for Penn State all season long when they've had a lot of ebbs and flows of what was working and what wasn't working on the football field. Ryan Barker, got to go back to game 2, a victory over Florida International. That's the only miss of a field goal he had, and it was from beyond 50, and it was blocked. So on every kick that he was able to get beyond the line of scrimmage on a field goal try this year, that thing went through the uprights. And today he hit 3 of them, a 48-yarder, a 43-yarder. The ball is hard. The turf is hard on a day like this, and he was money for Penn State, and he is probably under the radar for a lot of people, but he's not under the radar for Terry Smith. He told us Matt Campbell thinks the world of him, and Ryan Barker is going to be a key for roster retention because right now he's about as sure of a thing as you can get at the place kicker spot, and college football lacks these kind of guys, and he's got 2 years of eligibility left.
Yeah, Barker had a really nice game today. I think we felt the conditions. We could see the conditions. Didn't feel like the easiest thing out there. And he said that when he was out there he just had to stay warm all game. And he made sure to do that. So when they called on him, he was ready. I thought he had some interesting commentary where he wasn't quite sure what it was going to be like kicking in a baseball stadium like this. Because every stadium's different, like the sight lines, the backdrop. But he said that he got out there and he had no problem, and it showed. He said that, he was talking like he's going to be back next year. I think we think he'll be back next year. But he said that there's still some things to work out, when it comes to that. But he said he had a good conversation with Matt Campbell. He likes the staff. And I think that also, I think he genuinely wants to be at Penn State as an in-state kid, someone who has really, worked his way into this position.
Another in-state guy finished his season on a high note. As we said, Quentin Martin, he was asked about meeting with Matt Campbell. He said that meeting has not happened yet, but he thinks highly of Matt Campbell from what he's heard in some team meetings. Again, it's a consistent theme here of, okay, this was fun to watch. You did well. Are you staying with the team? And that's kind of where it is now with Penn State football. We're going to shut things down for this post-game episode because they're going to kick us out of Yankee Stadium any minute now. We don't want to piss off the people around here. But good experience here, Daniel. A different one when we're using hand warmers and by our keyboard. That's a bit different, but appreciate you for powering through on location for all 13 of these post-game podcasts. I've joined you for several of them, but great work from you all season long, buddy. And I know you've got basketball coming up and plenty of that. I know everyone's so excited about that hoops coverage, but you crushed it all season long here with the football team. I just want to thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. It's been a wild ride. I think it ended in a little differently than we thought it would, but that's why you play the games. That's the fun thing about this job.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Lions247 Podcast. Again, our final post-game edition here of 2025. On behalf of Daniel, I'm Tyler Donahue. We'll come back to you with some more episodes next week, focusing in on roster changes, staff changes, and Penn State coming off a 7-6 season after a 4th straight victory here. Shout out to Terry Smith. He heard those chants of Terry again, this time in the Bronx, and more tears in his eyes, and a nice way to finish off a challenging season for the Nittany Lions. For Daniel, I'm Tyler Donahue. Thanks for watching or listening to the Lions 247 podcast.